Hello, friends. On today's podcast, we are going to be taking a look at the rising rates of anxiety and mental illness among children, teens, and young adults. So that's what we're going to be diving down deep into today on the Foundation Worldview Podcast, where typically we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm thrilled that you've joined me for another episode today. Now, I am sure that most of you who are watching or listening have noticed that children and teens and young adults are experiencing very high levels of anxiety today. I noticed this even in my last few years of teaching that I taught for a decade. And in my last 2 years, I noticed so many of my students just deal with issues of high anxiety. In fact, I was the social studies teacher in third grade. So I taught social studies to all 3 sections of third grade. And in one of our units, it was a very basic unit on economics. And I taught the difference between goods and services. And in one of the lessons, I had students list both goods and services that their family utilized every week or every month. And I noticed that my last 2 years of teaching, a high percentage of students listed either a therapist, a counselor, or a psychologist as a service that they utilized every week. And I thought, wow, what is going on? Why are there so many more third graders that are in need of mental health help? And I'm sure that you've noticed this as well. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at findings from a book that has been a very popular book called The Anxious Generation. I don't know how to pronounce the author's last name correctly, but it's either Jonathan Haidt or Jonathan Haidt. But in this book, he dives down deep into research behind this mental health epidemic among children, teens, and young adults. So highly recommend that you check out this book. What we're going to do in this podcast today is we are going to highlight some of the findings from this book and look at how the research behind these findings really aligns with the worldview presented in Scripture, because this book is not written from a biblical worldview. It's written from a secular perspective. However, the findings really align with what we would expect in the world around us because of the worldview that's presented in Scripture. So as this author, as he dove down deep into the research behind what is causing these rising levels of anxiety, he concluded that there were 2 main factors contributing to this. And so I'm going to read a quote from this book where he explains this. In recent decades, America and many other Western nations made 2 contradictory choices about children's safety, and both were wrong. We decided that the real world was so full of dangers that children should not be allowed to explore it without adult supervision. Then we left children free to wander through the wild west of the virtual world where threats to children abounded. So there's these 2 main factors. The first is overprotecting children in the real world. And then the second is underprotecting them in the virtual world. So what I'm going to do is today, I'm just going to dive down deep into this first issue, this overprotection in the real world. In the next podcast, we're going to look at the underprotection in the virtual world. And then I'm going to do a third podcast where we look at, okay, what should we do now that we know these 2 big issues? Now, this first main factor contributing to rising levels of anxiety and mental illness, this overprotection in the real world, is something that you have probably noticed as you have compared your own childhood to the childhood that your children are now experiencing. I know that I have seen this issue at play in so many ways in the world around me. I first noticed this when I was teaching, and I noticed that there were such strict rules around playground usage. And I know that when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, that there were definitely rules on the playground, but for the most part at recess, we could just go outside, we could run around in the fields, we could play in the playground, and there weren't too many different restrictions. However, when I started teaching, I know that there were so many playground rules. And I know that there was even some times where I would get into a disagreement with another teacher over the things that I would allow my students to do, that I would allow them to swing and then jump off the swings, or I would allow them to climb on high places on the structure. And I know that some of the other teachers I was working with, who were wonderful teachers, were like, that's dangerous. And I was thinking, Yes, there is some risk involved, but it's a normal childhood risk. And it's not like the child is at risk of death. And so there's just much stricter rules around playground usage. I also noticed this with a friend that I had, that I have, who is teaching at a great private school. But there was one situation that happened with one student where this student was supposed to go down to the nurse at a certain time during the school day to get his medication. He did it every day. Well, he did it this one day, and he decided that on his way back to his classroom, he wanted to go outside and leave the school building. And so he went outside and he was just exploring outside. And the teacher realized that the student wasn't there and called the office, and they found the student who was wandering around outside. But the parent freaked out and, said, how could this happen? And blamed it all on the school, where who's really to blame? It's the child for not following the rules. This child should have known you don't go out of the building during the school day. But after that, all of a sudden, the school rules changed to children were not allowed to walk to the nurse by themselves, that they either had to have a buddy or they had to have their teacher walk them down. And all of a sudden, there was just all of this helicoptering. Then I also noticed, just with a lot of the families that I saw out in public and even some within my own sphere of influence, that parents are starting to do basic tasks for their children that their children should have been able to do at a much younger age. Like, I noticed parents starting to cut up food for children who were 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And I thought, my goodness, like, really by the time a child is 5 or 6, they should be able to, use a butter knife to be able to cut up their own food. Then I also noticed with older children, with teens, that so many teens weren't wanting to get their driver's license. And I thought, my goodness, like, why don't these kids like want this freedom? Like, I remember turning 16 and going and doing my driver's test and getting in the car for the first time and being like, this is freedom. And you have probably seen these examples and so many like it in the world around us, where we are just over protecting children. And in this book, The Anxious Generation, the author outlines how humans operate out of two basic modes. And one mode is discover mode, where we view the world around us as an opportunity for us to explore and to learn and to grow and to experiment. And this is the mode that children are designed to be in most of the time, because they're learning about the world around them. So children are designed to be in this discover mode. The second mode that we can operate out of as humans is defend mode. And this is the mode where we perceive a threat. And so rather than discovering and exploring, we're seeking to protect ourselves. It's like our fight or flight response has been triggered, and we're just seeking, how can we protect ourselves? Now, in this book, there's a quote that I'm going to read for us that is talking about these two different modes. And it says, healthy childhood with a lot of autonomy and unsupervised play in the real world sets children's brains to operate mostly in discover mode, with a well developed attachment system and an ability to handle the risks of daily life. Conversely, when there is society wide pressure on parents to adopt modern overprotective parenting, it sets children's brains to operate mostly in defend mode, with less secure attachment and reduced ability to evaluate or handle risk. So, with the societal pressure to overprotect our children and to make sure that there is never any risk and that they are always 100% safe, we are subconsciously placing our children in defend mode, teaching them that the world around them is not a place that has been designed primarily for them to discover and to learn, but as a place that is dangerous, that they need to defend themselves from, and that they need constant parental or adult protection in order to defend themselves. Now, it is vital for healthy growth and development that children be able to take developmentally appropriate risks. Risks such as playing in the yard by themselves, taking on basic chore responsibilities, caring for younger siblings, running an errand within walking distance or biking distance from the house. That these different types of risks are important for healthy child development. They're also part of discover mode, that when our children are allowed to play by themselves in the front yard or in the backyard, they're discovering what is all around them. Now, is there some inherent risk In that, yes, there's a risk that our child could fall down and get hurt. There's a risk that our child could make the decision to walk out into the streets. But these are things that we need to train them to think wisely about so that they can take these risks in playing by themselves or doing basic chores or caring for a younger sibling or running an errand. Now, in the book, The Anxious Generation, the author gives two different analogies of why it's so important for us to allow our children to take developmentally appropriate risks and not overprotect them. And the first analogy he gives is with trees, that in order for trees to grow properly and for them to be able to withstand just the natural elements that they're going to be exposed to, they need wind in order to properly grow. That what happens is when wind is blowing, wind bends trees, and this bending tugs on the roots and it compresses the wood in their trunks. The roots then respond to this tugging by expanding and providing a firmer anchor for the trees. When trees grow in a greenhouse, and they grow for most of their life in a greenhouse, and then they're transplanted out in the real world, they often fall over within the first few months simply from their own weight. Because in the greenhouse, they have not experienced any wind tugging against them. So therefore, their roots have not expanded and grown deeper, and their wood inside of their trunk has not compressed. So often, they're planted outside and then they fall over simply because of their own weight. And the author makes this connection to children. And he says that similar to how trees need wind to grow properly, to be able to support themselves, our children need to experience frequent minor stressors in order to become strong adults. That when we send our children this message that the world around them is a dangerous place and they need our protection, they're not growing deep roots. They're not becoming strengthened by small disappointments. And then when a disappointment happens, they just crumble. They become anxious. They develop mental health issues. The second analogy that the author gives is an analogy to the immune system. And I'm going to read a direct quote from the book to explain this. Parents who try to raise their children in a bubble of perfect hygiene are harming their children by blocking the development of their anti-fragile immune system. It's the same dynamic for what has been called the psychological immune system, the ability of a child to handle, process, and get past frustrations, minor accidents, teasing, exclusion, perceived injustices, and normal conflicts without falling prey to hours or days of inner turmoil. There is no way to live with other humans without conflicts and deprivations. And so, if we try to keep our children from all germs, what's going to happen is then once they are exposed to germs, their immune system is not going to have any practice fighting against it. It's not going to be strong. And our children are going to get much sicker when they are exposed to those germs than if we had just let them naturally be exposed to the germs in the world around them. Similarly, with how we are protecting our children, if we are over protecting them and their psychological immune system isn't developing, any little problem they encounter is going to cause them to crumble. And then there's a longer quote I want to read from this book, just talking about parenting style and how important it is. And this quote says, several studies find that coddling or helicopter parenting is correlated with later anxiety disorders, low self-efficacy, which is the inner confidence that one can do what is needed to reach one's goals, and difficulty adjusting to college. Children are intrinsically anti-fragile, which is why overprotective children are more likely to become adolescents who are stuck in defend mode. In defend mode, they're likely to learn less, have fewer close friends, be more anxious, and experience more pain from ordinary conversations and conflicts. Kids are hungry for thrills, and they must get them if they are to overcome their childhood fears and wire up their brains so that discover mode becomes the default. In the process, they develop a broad set of competencies, including the ability to judge risk for themselves, take appropriate action when faced with risks, and learn that when things go wrong, even if they get hurt, they can usually handle it without calling an adult. And so this quote is saying that it's so important for us to help our children be set in discover mode rather than defend mode, for them to be able to take healthy risks, for them to be able to handle setbacks so that they can grow to be young adults who know how to handle the difficulties of this world, because we live in a world where there's going to be difficulties. Now, the book goes through the major types of risks and thrills that kids need. And so in the book, it listed several. It said that kids need the thrill of heights, high speed, dangerous tools, dangerous elements, rough and tumble play, and disappearing. And the book specifically says that video games offer none of these types of thrills. Now, you may have thought power tools. This book isn't saying to send your kid out, your 3-year-old out with a chainsaw. Okay, that's a really dumb idea, very unwise. But we need to teach our children how to use tools and then give them the opportunity to use them on their own. The disappearing is the ability to go off by themselves, to be able to have time alone by themselves. Again, we're not going to send a 3-year-old down to the corner store to buy milk. Okay, that's just not developmentally appropriate. But we should give our 5 and our 6-year-old, and kids older than that, time to play in the backyard when we are not supervising them. Once children are 7 or 8, we should give them opportunities to run small errands on their own. Okay, so what we've covered so far today is the difference between discover mode and defend mode, and how if we are overprotecting our children, like our society is consistently encouraging us to do, our kids are going to be set in this defend mode, viewing the world around them as dangerous, rather than being in discover mode, viewing the world around them as something that needs to be explored and learned from, where they learn how to take appropriate risks and then come back from setbacks. So now what we're going to look at is, how does this issue of overprotection and the problem that it is, how does it align with the biblical worldview? Because as I mentioned, this book, The Anxious Generation, it is excellent. However, it's written from a secular worldview. But if you look carefully, you can see how all of the findings in this book align with the worldview presented in Scripture. And so one of the main ways that this issue of overprotection aligns with the biblical worldview is the fact that God has designed us in his image. And as God's image bearers, he has designed us to represent him on this earth through having dominion over the rest of creation. Genesis 1 verses 26 through 28 reads, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" So God has created our children with the purpose of representing him here on this earth through having dominion over the rest of creation. And when we ameliorate all risks, what we're doing is we're infantilizing our children. We're keeping them in this stage of infancy and dependency on us in a way that doesn't align with God's design. And when we take away all risks and just keep our children in this state of dependency, what we're doing is we are robbing them of their God-given need and calling to exercise dominion over the rest of creation. That they need to have opportunities to explore creation. If they don't, they're stuck in defend mode, trying to protect themselves from creation all of the time, rather than discovering and exploring and exercising dominion over creation, which God has given to us. When we take away all these risks and we keep them in this stage of dependence, our kids miss out on key physical, social, emotional, and spiritual developmental milestones. And what we're doing when we do everything for them and we view them as needing us in all of these different situations to do everything for them and to protect them from all risks, what we're doing is we're unintentionally sending the message that they are incapable of of fulfilling their God-given role of exercising dominion over creation. So we need to really take this seriously and make sure that we are not over protecting our children. So we're going to spend another whole episode exploring what we can do to reverse this trend and make sure that we are helping our children be programmed to be in discover mode so that they can grow in their responsibility of exercising dominion over creation. However, before we head into what we can do about this, on our next episode, we are going to explore the second key factor in this epidemic of rising anxiety and mental illness, which is giving our kids free rein in the virtual world. If you found the content of this podcast beneficial, please make sure that you like and subscribe. Doing so, make sure that you do not miss any future episodes. It also helps us out by making sure that this content gets in front of our current subscribers as well as those who are not yet current subscribers. If you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that question by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.